A California farmer sets fire to his own orchard. He planted every one of these trees himself, and by the winter of 1888, he is burning them down on purpose because something smaller than a grain of rice has made them worthless, and fire is the only thing left that stops it from spreading to the grove next door. Smoke rises over grove after grove across the state that winter, and nobody stops to mourn it because everyone already knows the alternative is worse. Leave the tree standing, and the infestation spreads to every branch around it. Burn it, and at least the fire draws a line the insect can't cross. By the end of this video, you will know exactly what drove men to burn their own livelihoods, the absurdly cheap gamble that saved an entire state's economy for the price of a used horse, and why this one strange, half-forgotten event from 1888 is the secret ancestor of nearly every invasive species disaster you have ever heard about. The thing destroying California's citrus wasn't a fungus. It wasn't a virus. It was an insect, fat and slow, and covered in a shield of white cottony wax, clamped onto branches and drinking trees dry from the inside. Growers called it the cottony cushion scale, and up close it looked almost decorative, like the trees had been dusted with snow. It wasn't decorative. Every one of those white patches was alive, and every one of them was feeding, motionless, permanently attached to the same spot on the same branch until the tree underneath it had nothing left to give. What made this insect nearly impossible to beat wasn't its appetite. It was its biology. Most animals need two to make more of themselves. This one didn't. The cottony cushion scale is a functional hermaphrodite, capable of fertilizing itself completely alone. A single insect, missed during a cleanup, ignored in a corner of one tree, could spawn hundreds of genetic copies of itself without ever encountering another living scale. Kill 99 out of 100, and you haven't won. You've left the one that starts the whole infestation over again, and it doesn't need a mate, a season, or luck to do it. Farmers tried the obvious answers first. Harsh soap washes stripped the wax coating, but left the insects underneath mostly untouched. Kerosene emulsion, painted directly onto bark, killed a portion of a colony and did nothing for the rest. While slowly poisoning the tree it was meant to protect. Neither approach came close to solving the problem, and the infestation kept climbing. So the growers escalated. Beginning around 1886, orchardists started wrapping entire mature citrus trees in massive canvas tents, sealing the edges against the ground, and pumping the enclosed space full of hydrogen cyanide gas. This wasn't some improvised backyard chemistry. It became a real, documented industrial process, one of the first large-scale fumigation systems ever developed in American agriculture, and it still wasn't enough. The gas killed what it touched, but reinfestation from untreated trees nearby was constant, and the labor and cost of tenting an entire grove tree by tree made it impossible to sustain across thousands of acres. Growers began gathering at state conventions to argue not over how to beat the scale, but over whether the citrus industry could survive it at all. In April of 1887, desperate enough to try anything, the California State Fruit Growers Convention invited the federal government's own chief entomologist to Riverside and asked him directly for a solution. Nobody in that room expected the answer to arrive from the other side of the planet, carried home in a wooden box by a man traveling under a fake job title. Charles Valentine Riley, chief entomologist for the United States Department of Agriculture, had a theory nobody else was pursuing. The cottony cushion scale hadn't originated in California. It had arrived from Australia, hidden on imported plants, sometime around 1868, and Australia's citrus and acacia trees weren't collapsing under this same insect. Something over there was already keeping it in check, something California had never had the chance to import alongside the pest itself. There was a problem. Congress had specifically banned USDA staff from international travel, a rule aimed squarely at Riley himself after years of frequent trips to Europe. So Riley found a workaround. An international exposition happening to take place in Melbourne that year needed an official American representative. Riley made sure that representative was his own colleague, an entomologist named Albert Cobley, sent abroad under a government title that had almost nothing to do with his actual mission. Cobley's real assignment, understood by exactly the people who needed to understand it, was to find whatever was eating this insect in its home country and bring it back alive. Cobley searched Australian gardens and orchards for months, cataloging insects, sending some specimens home that turned out to be useless. Weeks passed without a real breakthrough. Then, in October of 1888, in a garden north of Adelaide, he found it. A small beetle, marked in red and black, barely larger than a grain of rice, feeding directly on cottony cushion scale wherever the two crossed paths. It didn't nibble cautiously. It hunted the scale down and consumed both the adults and their eggs, methodically, colony by colony, moving from one infested branch to the next, like it had been built for exactly this purpose. Coable packed and shipped what he could catch. The first batch, 28 beetles, arrived in Los Angeles on November 30th, 1888. A second shipment of 44 followed on December 29th. A third, carrying 57 more, landed on January 24th, 1889. In total, across 3 fragile transoceanic shipments in the dead of winter, 129 living beetles survived the journey. Entomologist D.W. Coquelet received them in Los Angeles and made a decision that would end up defining the entire outcome. Rather than scattering the beetles thin across many farms, he concentrated all of them under a single canvas tent, sealed over one heavily infested citrus tree on the Wolfskill Ranch. Inside that enclosed space, the beetles had nowhere to go but toward the scale, and nothing to eat but the exact pest they'd been shipped across an ocean to destroy. By April, that single tree was clean. Not damaged, less clean. Coquelet opened the tent and let the beetles loose into the rest of the orchard, and what happened next moved faster than anyone had dared to hope. The Vidalia beetle breeds quickly, and with an unlimited food supply waiting on every branch, the population didn't just grow, it multiplied on a curve. Word spread through the citrus country almost as fast as the beetles themselves did. Within weeks, growers from across Southern California were showing up at Wolfskill with infested branches, trading cuttings for a jar of beetles to carry home in the back of a wagon. One grower who received an early colony reported that his own beetles multiplied so quickly he ran out of people willing to take them off his hands. By June, officials had distributed more than 10,000 of them to over 200 separate growers, and the number kept climbing every week that followed. Less than a year after Coble first spotted that beetle in an Adelaide garden, by the fall of 1889, the cottony cushion scale had been effectively wiped out across the infested regions of California. Orchards that growers had been preparing to abandon were producing full harvests again. The total cost of the entire operation, from Coble's voyage to the final distribution, came to roughly $1,500, against an industry that had been staring at total collapse. There was one final, almost comic complication nobody had planned for. By that autumn, the Vidalia beetles had done their job so completely that scale insects became genuinely hard to find. With their food supply vanishing, the beetles began turning on each other, consuming their own eggs and larvae just to survive. Growers who had spent a year begging for beetles now found themselves in the strange position of deliberately preserving small pockets of the very pest they'd fought so hard to eliminate, just to keep enough of a food source alive to sustain the predator that had saved them. It was the kind of problem nobody complains about twice. A state that had been burning its own orchards a year earlier, now carefully rationing out the last surviving colonies of the insect that had nearly ruined it. The numbers told the real story better than anyone's memory could. Fresh orange shipments out of Los Angeles County alone jumped from around 700 rail carloads to nearly 2,000 within a single year of the beetle's release. A 5-fold increase built entirely on an industry that had been preparing to die. Decades later, Rachel Carson, the biologist whose writing would go on to launch the modern environmental movement, looked back at what happened in that citrus grove and called it the world's most famous and successful experiment in biological control. She wasn't exaggerating for effect. By the time she wrote those words, nothing else in the history of the field had come close to matching it. What happened in that citrus grove became something much larger than one solved problem. It became a proof of concept, and within a decade, entomologists in other countries were writing to California asking exactly how it had been done. If a predator, carefully identified and deliberately relocated, could erase an entire agricultural disaster for the price of a horse and a boat ticket, then the same logic could apply anywhere, against anything. This single, spectacular success is the direct ancestor of every predator release story that came after it. It's the reason people looked at cane toads overrunning sugarcane fields decades later and thought, bring in something that eats them. It's the reason islands around the world saw venomous snake problems and reached for the same idea. Import a natural enemy. Let biology finish the job humans couldn't. Most of those later attempts didn't end the way California's did. Cane toads became a catastrophe of their own, poisonous enough to kill the native predators that tried to eat them instead of controlling anything. Imported mongooses wiped out ground-nesting birds instead of the snakes they were sent to kill, in one case after another, on island after island. Each of those stories started from the same hopeful place this one did, chasing the ghost of a single perfect success that happened almost accidentally in a citrus grove outside Los Angeles in 1889. Nobody chasing that success seemed to ask the one question California had answered mostly by luck: whether the predator being introduced would actually stay loyal to the one target it was sent to kill. So the real question worth sitting with isn't whether humans should try to fix ecological disasters with more biology. It's why one attempt worked so cleanly, while so many that followed it went so badly wrong, and whether anyone chasing that first success ever really understood what made it different. One country right now is trying something that's never been attempted before, physically undoing a predator release more than a century after the fact, sending an entire population back to where it originally came from. That story is coming next, and you will not want to miss it.